Okay, so what I'm building is a Spotify playlist creator, and this is an endpoint that I'm using. Here's the anime chain. I use this to get the random anime character quote, and the account and authorized is to use to send authorized request, and it will redirect to receive code later. And this one is to request access token with the authorization code that we receive at this endpoint. And the API Spotify.me is used to get the user profile, and I need the Spotify ID in the profile to create the playlist. And then the last one is used to create the playlist. And then let's move on to the diagram. So you can see there are 5 entities, but actually only 4 of them are actually used, and this one is for authentication and is put there for better looking. It's not too messy. So first, the user will send a GET request to server, and the server will check for user ID in cookie, and if not, it will assign one, and then send back the index HTML. And I use a user ID because there's potentially can be many users use the connect with server, so the user ID can help the server to uniquely identify the client. And then the user will supply the data, which is the playlist name, and then it will send a post request of create playlist to the server and include the playlist name. And then the server will check for the access token in the cache using the user ID in cookie. And this authentication thing can be skipped if the access token is in the cache and is not expired. And then if if it is expired or not found any cache, and then it will generate a state, and it will save the playlist and the state into the auth sessions array, and then it will send a 02 temporary redirect to the account Spotify that authorized with those attributes like client ID, which is used to uniquely identify our server, and the scope, and the state, and the response type equal to code. This is required to be like this, and the redact URL, which the URL that will the Spotify server will redirect after the user is signing. And then here's the user when the browser sees the 02, and it will send a GET request to Spotify authentication API with this field, and then the authentication of Spotify will receive the request, and then it will return a login form, and the user will log in, and then the Spotify authentication will return a send a redirect request to user, and the browser sees that request and redirect to our receive code resource. And then when our server receives the receive code, it will check the state in the all sessions array and to see if it is part of the previous request, and if not, it will return the 44. Yeah, and then once it finds the state, and it will send the access token request to the authentication. Yeah, with this endpoint, like the API slash token, and with some information required, like the green type has to equal to authorization code, and the redact URL, which is used to for verification purpose, it is not redirected to anywhere, and the code, which is authorization code, and the and the header has to include the client ID and the client secret, and then the Spotify authentication API will return 200 OK and also the access token, and then our server will cache the access token, use user ID from the cookie. Basically, it's in the cache folder. And in cache folder, there's the access token folder, and the JSON file name will be the user ID, and the information will be access token and also the expiration. And then after we get the access token, now we can really interact with Spotify API and use the user's resource. And then we want to create a playlist. However, the playlist needs the Spotify ID of that user. So we have to send a request to get the Spotify ID. And this one can also be skipped if we have a valid Spotify ID and it is cached. So the first step is check cache, and this one can be skipped if the cache is unexpired. And if it is expired, then it will send a GET request to the Spotify, and then with the access token to get the user profile, and then Spotify will return the user profile, and we cache the Spotify ID in that user profile. Yeah, and the next step is to get the anime quote, which is now you can see here we send a request to the anime chain to get a random anime character and the code quote, and returns this. And the next step, with all the information we have Spotify ID and also the random character. So now we can send the create playlist, and the request is a post request, and the authorization needs the access token, and the name field is playlist name, and it will be the character name plus the playlist name, and it will send the request to Spotify, and it will return 201, and also the metadata of that of the playlist, include the URL of the playlist, and the server receives that information, and he will send a redirect request, redirect to the user, and the user receives the redirect, and the browser will send the redirect to the the playlist URL. Yeah, and then it will send to and then the web page will be redirect to the playlist. And then let me walk through the code. The top section basically create a server and listen on the port 9000, and the Spotify credential is saved at this location, which is right here. And then our server is listening, is running, and on each request, I wanted to console.log the request for which URL for me to better debug. And when user visit our website, it will send the request to the default or index.html, and then the get user ID from cookie will be run. This is run because the get user ID from cookie does two things. It first checks if the user ID is valid or if they have a user ID. Or if the user ID is not valid or they don't have one, it will assign a user ID. So this one will basically generate a user ID in most cases. And yeah, and then we write the head like 200 text HTML, and then we just send the index HTML to the user. And when the user receives the index HTML, you have a form to fill out, which is the playlist name. So when you fill out the playlist name, it will send a post request to the create playlist. So when we receive this one, we first want to get the playlist name from the request URL, like the search params. And then we want to check if the playlist name is actually entered, it's not a null value. So if yes, we return 4. Otherwise, we check the cookie user ID, and the cookie user ID is basically used to check the cache if the access token is valid or the Spotify ID is valid, because we don't want to request every time, and the user ID uniquely identifies each client. And the cookie, my cookie in this case will pretty much looks like this. The user ID equals to some user ID and it expires in this time. And in this case, we want to check if we have to request for the access token, because in each access token it expires in an hour. Yeah. So first it checks cache exists. So here does that, and then if the cache exists, and we want to check if it is expired. If it's not expired, we will continue to the next step, which is to send user profile request, because we can skip the authentication. Otherwise, we will begin the authorization thing. So first, it will generate a state variable, and our auth, and it will be pushed to the auth session array, include the playlist name, and it will redirect to Spotify. And here is the function of redirect to Spotify. It will basically visit the send 02 to user with this URL with these attribute like state used to recognize this request in the later process, and client ID, our app ID, and yeah, the redirect URL and the scope we want to get. And then this will be sent to the user, and the browser will send to the Spotify. And when Spotify receives that, it returns the login form to the user. So user actually logs in. Once it's logged in, it will Spotify will send a 302 to user with our redirect URL. So when we receive that request, it will be this section. So first, we still need to get the params. In this case, we have the authorization code and state, and then we want to check if the state is in one of our current session, and if not, we return 4. Otherwise, we still get the cookie user ID and continue to the next step with the playlist name and the authorization code. So next step is send access token request, and the code is right here. Here's the endpoint. And the post data we got into them. And these are required, like the code is the authorization code. Grant type has to be this. and the redirect URL is to still kind to verify the redirect URL from the last step when we receive the authorization code. And here it send the here is initialize the request. So the option is post, and the content type authorization is basic, and also it includes the client ID and client secret, and the content length is post data length, which is basically this. And we want to create a date object, and this is used to once we receive the access token, we need this value to set the expiration. So on arrow we console.arrow, and then on once response we receive a stream, and we parse that stream to message, and this part will make the message into an object, and then we want to create a access token cache, and the code is right here. And you can see we received the send time and also the cookie user ID. We make the expiration time variable, and then write file to the cache. And then after the cache is created, then we send the user profile request with the access token and user input cookie user ID. Here is the send user profile request. This part. And again, the first step is to check if we have that cache and if it is valid. So if it is valid, we can just move on to send anime quote. Otherwise, we request for the user profile. Here's basically send that request to the URL, to the endpoint, and with access token, and we receive a string, a response object, and here we parse it, and then we want to create the cache for it, and with the expiration time of basically 24 hours. And here's the one thing I have to say is that if the user changes the Spotify ID within 24 hours, the one stored in our cache will be invalid and lead to bad result. So we can to improve this thing by make the expiration time shorter. But in my opinion, in most cases, user won't actually change their Spotify ID, so it should be good. So back to the user profile request, we create a cache, and then we move on to the send anime quote request, and the code is right here. It is a GET request to this URL, to this endpoint, and we receive the response object. We listen on it, and we parse it, and then we will move on to the next step to actually create the playlist request. And here is the playlist request. So here's the URL, and the post data will be the name, which is the playlist name, and description will be nothing. And here is the part that send the post request. You can see we need the access token, and it's a post request, and on response we receive the string, we parse it into a string, and then we make an object. Then we want the user to redirect the user to the playlist URL, and this does that 02, and here's the URL of that playlist, and it will send to the user, and the user will be redirected to the playlist. You can see I use two cache, which access token and Spotify ID. Access token expire in an hour, and Spotify ID expire in 24 hours. And then let me show you a demo. Here's a demo. Let me first refresh it and make sure there's no cache. Okay, no cache. I'll refresh it and read the description, like enter a playlist name, get a random anime character combined with the playlist name, and the format will be the random anime name, the character name, and then your playlist name. So I'll say the name will be hello. It will direct me to the login page, like the Spotify login page. And what's happened behind is it sends to the authorized endpoint, and the browser redirect to here. So now we log in. Yeah, you can see the random anime character name with our playlist name, and the token and Spotify ID are cached. And in the bottom, the console, you can see that it says this part is the demo part we just went through. We first request the for index HTML, and then you fill out the format sent to us, and then we check the access token cache. It's not found because we deleted it, and then the authorization thing, and then you find the Spotify ID cache is still not found, and then we save that to the cache. I can prove that that the cache is used because we can see in the Spotify cache case. First, we check if the cache is found, and if it is found and it is valid, we use it and we return it, so it will not execute this line. Yeah, so basically the Spotify ID cache in use and Spotify ID cache not found or expired, only one of them will be printed. So in this case, you can see they not found it, and that is not executed. So let me show you again to prove that the cache is actually in use. Again, hello world, create playlist. Because we already signed in, so it will not redirect to the login form. You can see the random character name and our playlist name, hello world. And in the console, you can see here is a part of we received the request to create playlist. We found a token, and now we use the token, and then the Spotify ID cache found, and then the Spotify cache in use. And then the last thing I want to prove is that the requests are like is synchronous. First, so first is let's start with the send access token. So once we receive the whole request and parse it, then we will move on to the next step. And yeah, you can see that we only move to the next step in the callback function of this, and the callback will only be executed when the response is finished. And it is same in the user profile request. You can see it's in the callback. It will not execute it until the response is finished. The Spotify user profile is finished, and also it is also same in the anime code request. On the end event, we move on to the next step, and also it also same right here. Well, once it's parsed ended, we move on to next step, which is redirect. So basically the order the API being called is first is the Spotify to authorize, then it will send the user profile, send user profile. This is second, and these two are one. They're actually one. The different requests under the same step. Here's the two, and then we want to send the anime quote, and the last step is to the Spotify create playlist.